The lace at her collar felt like a hangman's knot, growing tighter with every hollow laugh that echoed from the parlor below. Clara stood before the vanity, her reflection a stranger in white. The girl in the mirror had the wild, haunted eyes of a cornered doe, a stark contrast to the expensive silk and pearls meant to proclaim her a fortunate bride. Fortunate. The word was ash in her mouth. Outside, the Wyoming wind howled its dissent, rattling the window pane as if in sympathy with the frantic beating of her heart. Below, Luther Raleigh was holding court. She could hear his booming voice, thick with whiskey and self-satisfaction. At 60 years, with a face like a weathered stone and eyes like chips of flint, he was not a husband. He was a deed holder. Her father, a man broken by drought and debt, had traded his only daughter for a cleared ledger and a few bags of coin. Clara was the final payment, the period at the end of a devastating sentence. The smell of his cigar smoke, which always clung to him like a shroud, snaked up the stairs and under her door. It was the scent of her cage. He'd patted her hand at the supper table, his knuckles thick and hairy, his thumbnail yellowed and long. "You'll make a fine mistress for my home, girl," he'd said, his gaze lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. "A bit skittish, but I'll break you of that soon enough." Tonight was the night, her wedding night. The minister had already left, his blessings feeling more like a curse. The guests were slowly departing, their carriage wheels crunching on the gravel drive. Soon, Luther would climb the stairs, his heavy footsteps a drumbeat marking her doom. Panic, cold and sharp, sliced through her. She looked at the girl in the mirror again, at the pale face and trembling lips. This was not her life. It couldn't be. Her mother had once told her that love should feel like sunshine after a long winter. What she felt for Luther Raleigh was the dead cold of the grave. The wind tore at the house again, and this time, a torrent of rain followed, lashing against the glass. The storm was her answer, an omen, an opportunity. With a surge of adrenaline that banished all hesitation, Clara moved. She didn't take the pearls or the small silver locket her mother had left her. Possessions were anchors, and she needed to be weightless. Her hands, clumsy with haste, fumbled with the dozens of tiny buttons on the back of the wedding gown. It was hopeless. Gritting her teeth, she grabbed a pair of sewing scissors from her mother's old workbox, the cold steel a shock against her palm. Without a second thought, she twisted and sawed at the fabric near her waist, tearing a long, ragged gash down the side. It was enough. She could breathe. She could move. She pulled on a pair of her father's old, worn riding boots she'd hidden under the bed, the rough leather a comfort against her silk stockings. She ripped the hem of the expensive gown, tearing it away at the knee so she could run. The sound of tearing silk was the sweetest music she had ever heard. It was the sound of freedom. Slipping out her bedroom door, she crept along the darkened hallway, her heart pounding against her ribs. The house was quieter now. Too quiet. She heard a floorboard creak below and froze, pressing herself into the shadows of the landing. Luther's voice rumbled, bidding a final guest good night. "I'll be up to see my bride shortly," he chortled. "A man deserves his reward." The words spurred her on. She didn't dare risk the main staircase. Instead, she made for the small servants' exit at the back of the house, her ruined dress whispering against the floorboards. The kitchen was dark and smelled of stale cake and spilled wine. The back door was bolted. Her trembling fingers struggled with the heavy iron lock, a sob of frustration catching in her throat. Finally, it gave way with a dull thud. The moment she stepped outside, the storm consumed her. Icy rain driven by a gale-force wind plastered the tattered remains of her white dress to her skin. Stealing her breath, she ran, stumbling through the muddy yard toward the stables, the grand house a monstrous silhouette against the turbulent sky. Her mare, Daisy, whinnied softly as she entered, her warm breath misting in the lanternless dark. Clara didn't bother with a proper saddle. She threw a heavy blanket over the horse's back, cinched a bridle, and led her out into the tempest. Mounting the horse was a clumsy, desperate struggle, the wet silk of her dress making her slip. She hauled herself onto Daisy's back, her legs shaking, her hands raw. She didn't look back. Kicking the mare into a gallop, she fled the town of redemption, a bride running from her own wedding night, swallowed by the wild, unforgiving darkness of the West. The rain, which had been her shield, soon became her enemy. Within an hour, it had turned to sleet, sharp and stinging against her exposed face and hands. The world had dissolved into a maelstrom of wind and ice. The trail, barely visible in the dark, became a treacherous river of mud. Daisy, a gentle creature meant for Sunday rides, was terrified, her ears pinned back, her eyes wide with fear. Clara clung to her, her body numb with cold, her initial burst of defiant energy draining away into shivering dread. She had no destination, no plan beyond escaping Luther's bed. She'd ridden north, toward the granite hills, a rugged, untamed wilderness where she hoped to lose herself. She had not accounted for the blizzard. The temperature plummeted. The sleet thickened into heavy, wet snow, blinding them. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at her clothes and pulling the heat from her bones. They were lost. Every rock and twisted pine looked the same in the swirling white. It happened without warning. A shadow, perhaps a fallen log or a rock outcrop, loomed suddenly in their path. Daisy shied violently, her hooves slipping on a patch of ice-slick stone. The world tilted, a chaos of flailing limbs and the mare's terrified scream. Clara was thrown, her body arcing through the air before she landed hard against a cluster of jagged rocks. A blinding, searing pain shot up her leg, followed by a sickening crack that echoed louder than the storm. Then, her head struck stone, and the world went black. Daisy, panicked and riderless, bolted into the white abyss, leaving Clara a small, broken figure in a ruined white dress, slowly being buried by the relentless snow. Death was a quiet, cold thing. It seeped into her through the wet silk, numbing her fingers and toes first, then creeping up her limbs like a slow tide. She drifted in and out of consciousness, each waking moment a fresh wave of agony from her shattered leg and the throbbing in her head. The storm was a distant roar, the world a blurry wash of white. She thought of her mother's warm hands, of the scent of baking bread, of a life she would never have. A single tear froze on her cheek. This was the end of her flight. She had escaped Luther Raleigh only to be claimed by the wilderness. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the encroaching silence. Just as the last vestiges of warmth were about to be extinguished, a new shape emerged from the blizzard. It was not a rock or a tree. It was a figure, broad-shouldered and wrapped in heavy furs, leading a sturdy pack mule. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if sensing something amiss. May Perkins didn't like storms, but she respected them. They were a part of the land, a cleansing force that kept the world honest. She was heading back to her cabin from her trap lines, checking them one last time before the blizzard settled in for good. When she saw it, a flash of white against the gray rock that didn't belong, it looked like a drift of snow, but something about its shape was wrong. Curiosity, and a hard-won instinct for survival that extended to all creatures, pushed her forward. She dismounted, her boots sinking into the deep snow, and approached the shape. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a woman, or a girl, more like. Her face was as white as the snow clinging to her eyelashes, her lips a faint, bloodless blue. She was dressed in the tattered remains of a fine gown, a garment so out of place in these unforgiving hills it was like a vision from another world. May knelt, her gloved hand brushing the snow from the girl's cheek. The skin was ice cold, but beneath it, she felt the faintest flicker of life. She checked the girl's pulse at her throat. It was thready, weak, but it was there. May looked around. No horse, no tracks that hadn't already been erased by the storm. This girl had been cast out here by fate, and May had been sent to find her. "Hold on, child," May murmured, her voice a low rumble against the wind. "You're not dying today." With a strength born from years of solitary life, chopping wood, hauling water, and carving an existence from the granite heart of the mountains, May gathered the girl into her arms. She was lighter than a sack of flour, a fragile thing of bone and wet silk. May carried her to the mule, carefully draping her over its back. She wrapped her own heavy oilskin coat around the girl's limp body, a desperate attempt to shield her from the biting wind. Leading the mule, May turned back toward the faint promise of smoke and shelter, her face set in a grim line. The blizzard could have this land for the night, but it wouldn't have this life. Not if May had anything to say about it. The first thing Clara was aware of was warmth, a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to be coaxing her soul back into her body. It was a blessed relief after the endless, consuming cold. The second was the scent of pine smoke and something savory, like stew. The third was pain, a dull, throbbing ache in her head and a sharp, insistent fire in her left leg. Her eyelids felt heavy as lead weights. She forced them open, blinking against the soft glow of a lantern. She was lying on a narrow cot, covered by a thick patchwork quilt and a heavy buffalo hide. The room was small, the walls made of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a crackling fire within it casting dancing shadows. This was not her room. This was not Luther Rawley's house. A woman sat in a rocking chair by the fire, her back to Clara. She was stirring a pot that hung over the flames, her movements economical and sure. Her hair was a thick, dark braid threaded with silver, and her shoulders were broad under a simple wool shirt. Clara tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness and a sharp spike of pain from her leg forced her back down with a choked gasp. The sound made the woman turn. Her face was striking, etched with the fine lines of someone who had spent more time under the sun and sky than under a roof. Her eyes were a clear, startling gray, and they held a look of calm appraisal, with no hint of surprise. "Easy now," the woman said. Her voice was the one from the storm, low and steady. "You've got a bad break in that leg, and a knot on your head the size of a goose egg. You lie still." She rose from her chair and came to the bedside, ladle in hand. She wasn't smiling, but her expression was not unkind. It was the face of someone who didn't waste energy on sentiment but focused on what needed to be done. Where am I?" Clara whispered, her throat dry and raw. "My cabin? Up in the granite hills," the woman answered, dipping the ladle into a wooden bowl. "Name's May. I found you out in the storm. You're lucky. Another hour, and there'd have been nothing left for the wolves to find." The bluntness of it sent a shiver through Clara. She looked down at herself. Someone had cut away the remnants of her wedding dress and clothed her in a soft, oversized flannel nightgown. Her leg was tightly bound in a crude but firm splint. Shame, hot and prickly, washed over her. She was a stranger, a burden, a runaway bride found half dead in the snow. "Thank you," she managed to say, the words feeling pitifully inadequate. May just nodded. "Drink this," she said, holding the bowl to Clara's lips. It was a rich, hot broth, and as it slid down her throat, she felt a fragile strength return. It was then that she noticed they were not alone. In the far corner of the cabin, cloaked in shadow away from the firelight, a man was sitting at a small table, sharpening a large knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone was a menacing sound in the quiet room. He hadn't looked up, hadn't moved when she'd woken, but Clara felt his presence like a physical weight. He was a pillar of stillness, a silent observer to her waking. As if feeling her gaze, he stopped his work. He lifted his head, and his eyes met hers across the room. If May's face was carved from the practical earth, his was hewn from the harsh, unforgiving rock of the mountains themselves. He was younger than May, perhaps 30, with a strong jaw shadowed by dark stubble and a head of thick, unruly black hair. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a deep, piercing blue, and they were utterly devoid of warmth. They looked at her not with curiosity or pity, but with a cold, guarded suspicion. He was vaster than the small cabin, a coiled spring of muscle and silence. His hands, resting on the table, were large and calloused, the hands of a man who worked hard and fought harder. This was Elias. He held her gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before he deliberately looked away, back to his knife, and the scraping sound resumed. The dismissal was as clear as if he had spoken it aloud. "You are not welcome here." Clara shrank back into the pillows, her fear of Luther Raleigh replaced by a new, more immediate anxiety. She had run from one cage only to find herself in another, trapped by a blizzard and her own broken body, at the mercy of a stoic widow and a silent, hostile cowboy. The first days passed in a haze of pain and sleep. May was a constant, gentle presence. She changed the dressings on Clara's head, fed her broth and stew, and reset the splint on her leg with a practiced hand, explaining that she'd set bones for more horses and cattle than she could count. She spoke little, asking no questions about who Clara was or where she came from. She simply tended to her needs with a quiet efficiency that was both comforting and unnerving. Elias remained a ghost. He was there, and then he was gone. He would leave before dawn, the soft thud of his boots on the floorboards the only sign of his departure. He would return at dusk, covered in snow, smelling of pine and cold air, a brace of rabbits or a side of venison slung over his shoulder. He moved through the small cabin with a silent grace that belied his size, avoiding the space around Clara's cot as if it were contaminated. He never spoke to her. He would direct his words, few as they were, only to May. "Storm settling in for the long haul," he'd grumble, shaking snow from his hat. Or, "Fence line by the north pasture is down." He ate his meals with them at the small table, but he ate in silence, his gaze fixed on his plate. Clara, trapped in her bed, watched him. She watched the way the firelight caught the sharp planes of his face, the way his powerful shoulders strained the fabric of his shirt as he stoked the fire. She saw the deep-seated weariness in his eyes, a pain that seemed older than his years. He had been betrayed. May had told her in a rare moment of conversation, by a woman back east who had promised everything and delivered nothing but heartache. He had come west to lose himself, and had found a quiet harbor in May's isolated world. He was a man who had built a wall around his heart, and Clara, a refugee from a life she hadn't chosen, was an unwelcome intruder trying to shelter within its shadow. The tension in the small cabin was thick enough to taste. It was in the long, drawn-out silences, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. It was in the way May's shoulders would tighten ever so slightly when Elias entered the room, a silent acknowledgement of the disruption Clara's presence had caused. It was in the stolen glances between Elias and Clara, his sharp and assessing, hers fearful and questioning. Three people, trapped together by a storm, each nursing their own wounds, their own secrets, their own profound loneliness, all under one small roof in the vast, white heart of the wilderness. The air crackled with unspoken words, with the heavy weight of the past and the terrifying uncertainty of the future. The blizzard raged for 2 weeks, imprisoning them in the small log cabin. For Clara, it was a time of healing that felt like a different kind of confinement. Her days were a slow, painful rhythm of waking, eating the broth May spoon-fed her, and drifting back into a feverish sleep. The world was reduced to the 4 walls of the cabin, the crackle of the fire, and the 2 quiet figures who moved within it. As the fever broke and the sharpest edges of her pain dulled to a persistent ache, awareness returned. With it came a profound sense of uselessness. She lay on her cot, a broken doll in borrowed flannel, while May and Elias worked from before sunrise to long after sunset. May tended the fire, cooked, mended, and checked her traps near the cabin. Elias would disappear into the white maelstrom for hours, returning with firewood stacked to his chin or fresh meat from a hunt, his silence as vast and impenetrable as the winter landscape. Clara watched their hands. May's were nimble and sure, whether she was skinning a rabbit or stitching a tear in Elias's worn coat. Elias's hands were a different country altogether. They were large, scarred, and calloused. Yet they could be surprisingly gentle as he banked the fire for the night or repaired a leather strap. She felt like a child, utterly dependent, and the shame of it was a constant, bitter taste. "I need to do something," she announced one morning, her voice thin but resolute. May was kneading dough on a floured board, her back to Clara. Elias was by the door, pulling on his heavy boots. May glanced over her shoulder. "You need to heal." "I can't just lie here," Clara insisted, pushing herself up on her elbows. "My hands work. My leg is broken, not my spirit." A flicker of something, perhaps respect, crossed May's face. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked over, appraising Clara's determined expression. "All right," she said. "There's a basket of mending by the hearth. Think you can manage a needle and thread?" It was a start, propped up with pillows. Clara spent her days mending socks, patching shirts, and sewing buttons. The simple, repetitive work was a balm to her frayed nerves. It made her feel she was contributing, however small the measure. It gave her a reason to be awake. As her leg began to mend, encased in Elias's cleverly fashioned splint, her world expanded from the cot to a chair by the fire. Elias had carved a crude but sturdy crutch for her from a piece of cured ash wood. The first time she tried to stand, he was there, a silent, looming presence. She wobbled, her good leg trembling from disuse, and nearly fell. A strong hand shot out and gripped her arm, steadying her. His touch was firm, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with her injury. "Thank you," she breathed, looking up at him. Elias just grunted, his gaze fixed on a point over her head. He released her arm as if it were a hot coal and turned away, leaving the warmth of his touch lingering on her skin. Slowly, she became a part of the cabin's ecosystem. She learned to plant onions and garlic to be hung from the rafters. She learned to grind corn for meal, her arm aching with the effort. She learned the rhythms of their life, the pre-dawn quiet when Elias would already be gone, the comfortable midday hum of May's work, and the tense, silent suppers. Elias began to watch her. He was subtle about it, his gaze shielded by his lowered head or the fall of his dark hair. But she felt it. He watched as she struggled to carry a small bucket of water from the barrel inside, her mouth set in a stubborn line, refusing May's offer of help. He watched her one afternoon as she sat by the window, her needle forgotten in her lap, her eyes distant as she stared out at the endless snow, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. He saw not just the helpless girl May had dragged from the storm, but a quiet strength, a core of resilience that bent but did not break. He was drawn to the contrast, the fragility of her form against the iron in her will. He had known women who used tears as weapons. Hers seemed to be a private grief, one she fought to overcome. It intrigued him, and the feeling unsettled him more than any blizzard. May saw it all. She saw the way Elias's gaze would linger on Clara for a moment too long. She saw the way his hands would clench by his sides when Clara nearly lost her balance on the crutch. She saw the thaw beginning in the man she had come to know as a fortress of ice, and with every glance, every subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere, a quiet ache settled deeper into May's own heart. She cared for Clara, had come to see her as the daughter she never had. She was bound to Elias by a shared tragedy that ran deeper than friendship. To see them drawn to one another was to stand on a fault line, feeling the ground beneath her feet begin to tremble. So she worked harder, her hands always busy, her face a calm mask that betrayed none of the sorrow she felt brewing inside. The nightmares started when Clara began to heal, as if her mending body could no longer suppress the terrors of her mind. They were always the same, the suffocating scent of Luther Raleigh's cigars, his wet, proprietary smile, his thick fingers reaching for her. She would wake up with a strangled gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs, the scratchy wool of the blanket feeling like his touch. One night, the dream was worse than ever. It was mixed with the chaos of her escape, the freezing rain, the mare's scream, the bone-jarring impact with the rocks. She woke up crying out, a raw, terrified sound in the sleeping cabin. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the room was filled with a deep, chilling cold. Shaking, her body slick with sweat despite the cold. She couldn't bear to be alone. Her gaze fell on May's bed, a larger frame on the other side of the hearth. In the dim light, she could see the shape of the older woman, a comforting mound under a pile of quilts. Driven by a desperate, childish need for comfort, Clara slipped from her cot. Using her crutch, she hobbled across the cold floorboards, each step an agony of both body and spirit. She stood over May's bed, a shivering, pathetic figure. "May," she whispered, her voice trembling. The woman stirred, then sat up, instantly alert. "Clara, what is it? Is it your leg?" "No," Clara choked out, fresh tears welling. "A dream. It was him." May needed no other explanation. She saw the raw terror on Clara's face, the desperate plea in her eyes. Without a word, she lifted the edge of her quilts in invitation. "Come on, child, get in. There's no sense in both of us freezing." Sobbing with relief, Clara slid into the bed. The warmth of May's body was immediate and profound. May wrapped a strong arm around her, pulling her close. Clara buried her face in the older woman's shoulder, her small, trembling frame pressed against May's solid one. She smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and a simple, honest strength. "It's all right," May murmured, her hand stroking Clara's hair. "You're safe here. He can't touch you here." They lay like that for a long time, two lost souls finding anchor in one another. Clara's ragged sobs slowly subsided into quiet shudders. May held her, not with pity, but with a deep, resonant empathy, her own lonely heart recognizing the shape of another's pain, in that shared warmth, under the heavy quilts. A bond was forged that had nothing to do with gratitude or necessity, but with a simple, human need for comfort in the dark. From the shadows of his own small bunk, built into the far wall, Elias watched. He had been woken by Clara's cry and had remained perfectly still. He saw her painful journey across the floor. He saw May's silent invitation. He saw them now, wrapped in each other's arms, a tableau of shared solace. A knot of something unfamiliar and deeply confusing tightened in his chest. He saw Clara's desperate vulnerability, a stark contrast to the stubborn girl who refused help with a water bucket. He saw May's fierce, maternal tenderness, a side of her she rarely showed. He felt a powerful, primitive urge to protect them both, to stand guard over this small circle of warmth they had created. But he also felt like an intruder, a witness to a mystery he couldn't comprehend. The sight stirred a part of him he thought had long since died, a longing for connection, for a softness that his hard life had denied him. Unable to process the turmoil of emotions, he quietly turned his face to the cold log wall, his heart a battlefield of warring instincts. Spring came hesitantly to the granite hills. Then, all at once, the snow melted, feeding rushing creeks and revealing a landscape scrubbed clean and new. The air grew warmer, filled with the scent of damp earth and pine. For Clara, who could now walk with only a slight limp, it was a rebirth. She began to venture outside, helping May tend to her small, protected garden where she grew herbs and hardy vegetables. The sun on her face felt like a benediction. She was gathering kindling near the edge of the woods one afternoon. The axe Elias had taught her to use feeling balanced and capable in her hands. She was so absorbed in the simple pleasure of the task, the clean snap of dry branches, that she didn't hear the warning. It was a dry, chilling rattle, coming from a patch of sun-warmed rocks just a few feet from where she stood. Clara froze, her blood turning to ice. She slowly lifted her head. Coiled on the rock, head raised, was a timber rattlesnake, its tongue flicking out to taste the air. Its tail was a blur, the sound an ancient promise of death. It was between her and the cabin. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she knew any sudden movement would provoke it to strike. Time seemed to slow down. She could see the intricate diamond pattern on its back, the cold, black beads of its eyes. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. "Don't move!" The voice came from behind her, low and calm, yet crackling with an urgent intensity. It was Elias. She hadn't heard him approach. He moved into her line of sight, placing himself between her and the cabin. He didn't look at her. His entire focus was on the snake. In his hand, he held the large skinning knife he was always sharpening. He moved with a liquid grace, a predator stalking a predator. "When I move, you go left," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Don't run, just walk away, understand?" Clara gave a tiny, jerky nod, her eyes wide with terror. Elias took another slow, deliberate step forward. The snake coiled tighter, its rattle growing louder, more frantic. Then, in a movement so fast it was almost invisible, Elias lunged, not at the snake, but to the side. The snake, its attention drawn, struck at the motion, its fangs extending. In that split second, as it was overcommitted, Elias moved again. He brought the knife down in a single, brutal, efficient arc, pinning the snake's head to the rock. The rattling stopped. The body thrashed for a moment, then went still. The silence that followed was deafening. Clara stood paralyzed, the axe forgotten in her hand. Elias straightened up slowly, his chest rising and falling. He wiped the blade on the grass and turned to her. His face was a hard mask, but his eyes were blazing with the aftermath of adrenaline. He crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides, and his hands were on her, gripping her arms, his fingers digging into her skin. "Did it get you?" he demanded, his voice rough. He spun her around, his eyes scanning her legs, her ankles. "Are you bit?" "No," she whispered, shaking her head. Her legs gave way, and she sagged against him. His arms came around her instinctively, holding her up. Her face was pressed against the rough wool of his shirt. She could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart against her cheek, a stark contrast to her own frantic fluttering. She could smell the scent of him, sweat, leather, and pine. For a moment, they just stood there, his body a shield around hers, her body trembling with shock and relief. He held her for a fraction of a second too long. It was a subtle shift, a change in the pressure of his hands, a hesitation in his breath. He became aware of the softness of her body against his hard frame, of the way her hair smelled like the wildflowers she'd been standing near. She lifted her head, and her eyes, wide and luminous, met his. The space between them crackled. The world narrowed to the few inches that separated their faces. The danger was gone, but a new, more complicated tension had taken its place. They were no longer just a man and a woman sharing a roof. They were a man and a woman who had just stared down death together, and were now pressed against each other, every nerve ending alive and screaming. He could feel her breath on his lips. He saw her lips part slightly. The raw, physical reality of their closeness overshadowed everything else. With a muttered curse, Elias abruptly let her go, stepping back as if he'd been burned. He turned away, running a hand through his hair, his composure shattered. "Be more careful," he bit out, his back to her. "Watch where you're walking." He strode off toward the cabin without another word, leaving Clara standing alone, her body still humming from the shock, from the fear, and from the undeniable, terrifying thrill of his touch. That evening, the silence at the supper table was heavier than ever. Clara couldn't eat. She kept replaying the moment in her mind, the deadly rattle, Elias's swift violence, and the shocking intimacy of his arms around her. Her heart, which had only just returned to a normal rhythm, began to race every time she risked a glance at him. After the meal, Elias went outside to chop wood. The rhythmic thud of the axe, a restless, angry sound in the twilight. May was sitting by the fire, knitting, but her needles were still. She was watching Clara. "You're quiet tonight," May said softly. Clara looked up, her cheeks flushing. She couldn't hold it in any longer. The emotions were a flood threatening to drown her. "May," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Something happened today." She told her everything. The snake, the terror, the way Elias had saved her. But she stumbled when she got to the part where he held her, unable to find the words for the chaotic storm of feelings it had unleashed. May's expression didn't change, but her gray eyes were knowing. She put her knitting aside. "He protected you. That's his way." "It was more than that," Clara confessed, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. Her gaze fell to the floor. "When he held me, my heart, I've never felt anything like it. It felt—" She trailed off, ashamed of the intensity of her own feelings. "It scares me, May, the way I feel when I look at him." May was silent for a long moment. The only sound the crackling of the fire and the distant thud of the axe. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle, but laced with a profound, hidden sadness. She reached out and placed her hand over Clara's. "Love is a frightening thing, child. It always is." She gave a small, sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Elias is a good man, a better man than he knows." She squeezed Clara's hand, then drew back, her face becoming a carefully neutral mask once more. Clara saw the glimmer of unshed tears in her eyes before May turned her head toward the fire, hiding them in the flickering shadows. Clara felt a pang of guilt, a sudden awareness that her confession had caused this wise, kind woman a pain she couldn't understand. She wanted to ask more, to understand the history that bound May and Elias together, but she didn't know how. Later that week, she found the courage. They were salting a side of venison, their hands working together in the quiet rhythm of domesticity. "May," Clara began carefully, "how did you and Elias meet?" May paused, her knife stilling over the meat. She stared down at her work, her thoughts 1,000 miles away. "He came through here about 3 years back, just drifting. He was half-starved and running from ghosts I didn't need to see to know they were there." She resumed her work, her movements slower now. "He stayed on to help with chores. The arrangement worked for us both. He needed a place to be quiet, and I needed help." The word hung in the air. There was a story behind it, a deep well of it. "And your husband?" Clara asked, her voice soft. May's hand stopped completely. She set the knife down and wiped her hands on her apron, a slow, deliberate gesture. She walked to the mantelpiece and picked up a small, crudely whittled wooden bird. "His name was Samuel," she said, her voice low and even, as if reciting a memorized fact. "He was a good man, a carpenter. He saw the world in straight lines and right angles. He was kind." She ran a thumb over the smooth wood of the bird. "He went into redemption for supplies 5 years ago. There was a dispute. A man, a land speculator with a cruel streak, claimed Samuel owed him money." She took a deep breath. "Samuel wasn't a fighter. He was shot down in the street, right in front of the general store." Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Redemption, the same town. Her blood ran cold. May's eyes were fixed on the bird, her gaze turned inward, back to a day she relived 1,000 times. "They left him lying there. Nobody wanted to get involved. By the time I got the news and rode into town, it was almost dark." Her voice was flat, stripped of all emotion. "He was just lying in the mud." She looked up, and her clear gray eyes met Clara's. The grief in them was so vast, so deep, it was like looking into an open grave. "Elias was in town then, working at the livery. He didn't know me, didn't know Samuel, but he was the only one who wasn't afraid or indifferent. He helped me carry Samuel's body onto my wagon." She paused, her throat working. "And when I brought him back here, to bury him on the ridge where he loved to watch the sunrise." Elias followed. He didn't say a word. He just took the shovel from my hands and dug the grave himself. "Right over there." She nodded toward the window, toward the gently sloping hill behind the cabin, the hill that glowed with wildflowers now that spring had come. Elias, the cold, silent man, had been the one to bury May's husband. The realization struck Clara with the force of a physical blow, finally explaining the unbreakable, unspoken bond between them. It wasn't built on friendship or convenience. It was built on a foundation of shared tragedy, a debt of kindness offered in a moment of absolute despair. And they had built their quiet, wounded life on top of it. In the dust-choked town of Redemption, Luther Raleigh was not a man accustomed to being defied. Humiliation was a foreign country to him, and he had no intention of applying for a visa. He sat in the darkest corner of the saloon, a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses on the rough plank table. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and cheap perfume, an atmosphere he usually found invigorating. Tonight, it only soured in his stomach. Across from him sat 2 men who seemed born of the saloon's shadows. The first, Jed, was a wiry man with a face like a weasel and pale, restless eyes that missed nothing. His partner, Silas, was his opposite, a hulking brute of a man. His face a roadmap of old scars, his knuckles thick and permanently bruised. They were not lawmen. They were the sort of men one hired when the law was an inconvenience. "She's a slip of a thing," Luther rasped, his voice a low growl. He pushed a heavy canvas bag across the table. It landed with a dull, metallic clink. "Fair-haired, blue eyes. Looks more fragile than she is. Got a stubborn streak wide as the Platte River." Jed's thin lips curled into a semblance of a smile. He didn't touch the bag. "Runaway bride, you said. Gets cold feet. It happens." "This ain't cold feet," Luther snarled, leaning forward, his face ruddy in the lantern light. "This is theft. She is my property. Paid for, fair and square. She ran off on our wedding night. In the dress I bought her. That's an insult. In my town. To me." The rage was a physical thing, making the wattles of his neck tremble. It wasn't about a lost love. It was about a tarnished investment, a public slap in the face. Silas grunted, his first contribution to the conversation. "Where'd she run?" "North, into the Granite Hills," Luther said, sinking back into his chair. "Took a mare from my stables. A blizzard hit that night. Most folk think she's dead, frozen in a ditch somewhere." "But you don't," Jed stated, his pale eyes narrowing. "I know her kind," Luther spat. "She's a survivor, like a damn cockroach. I want her back, not for my bed, not anymore. The thought of her now turns my stomach." His eyes were chips of ice. "I want her brought back to town and put in the stocks for public disgrace, for breaking a sacred contract. I want everyone to see what happens when someone makes a fool of Luther Raleigh." Jed finally reached out and drew the bag of coins toward him. He hefted it, judging its weight. "And the horse?" "Shoot the horse," Luther said without a moment's hesitation. "And if she's with anyone, if some squatter or drifter took her in, leave no witnesses. I want her alone and broken. Is that clear?" Jed's weasel-like smile returned, genuine this time. He looked at Silas, who gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Clear as a mountain spring. Mr. Raleigh." The peace in the cabin was a fragile thing, as delicate as a spider's web in the morning dew. They had settled into a new rhythm, one dictated by the lengthening days of spring. But beneath the surface of shared chores and quiet meals, the air was stretched thin, humming with an unspoken tension that had only grown since the day of the snake. Elias felt it most keenly at dusk. It was his favorite time of day, when the harsh edges of the world softened and the sky bled into shades of purple and orange. He was checking the horses in the small corral he'd built. the scent of pine sharp on the cooling air. When a flicker of movement at the tree line caught his eye, it was nothing. Likely a deer or a fox, but some primal instinct, honed by years of living on the edge of civilization, made him freeze. He stood perfectly still, letting his eyes adjust to the deepening shadows. He wasn't looking for a shape, but for an absence of one, a patch of darkness that was too solid, too still. And then he saw it again. Not an animal. An animal moves with the rhythm of the wilderness. This was the hesitant, jerky movement of a man trying not to be seen. His body went rigid. His hand instinctively moved to the handle of the revolver holstered at his hip. He didn't draw it. He just stood, a silent statue, letting the lurker believe he was unseen. He watched for another 5 minutes as the shadow detached itself from the trees, crept 20 yards closer, and then melted back into the forest. A scout, taking the lay of the land. Elias's blood ran cold. This wasn't a lost trapper or a wandering prospector. This was a threat. His mind raced. Had Luther Raleigh's reach truly extended this far? Had Clara's past finally caught up to them? He finished with the horses, his movements calm and deliberate, betraying none of the alarm that was screaming through his veins. He walked back to the cabin, the setting sun at his back. When he stepped inside, the warm, comforting scene. May stirring a pot, Clara setting out wooden bowls, felt like a world under glass, beautiful and terribly fragile. "Everything all right?" May asked, sensing the change in him immediately. Elias nodded, not meeting her eyes. "Just getting cold." He walked to the corner where his rifle leaned against the wall. He picked it up, checked the action with a series of smooth, efficient clicks, and then began methodically cleaning the barrel. He didn't say a word about what he had seen. There was no need to frighten them yet. But the act of cleaning his rifle, in the middle of the cabin, in the hour before supper, was a statement louder than any words. It was a promise. He was the guardian at the gate, and the wolves were circling. The tension in the cabin, already a low hum, ratcheted into a high-pitched whine. May saw the rifle and understood. Her face became a stoic mask, but her hands trembled slightly as she ladled stew into the bowls. Clara, seeing May's reaction, felt a new wave of fear. This was because of her. She had brought this danger to their door. In the days that followed, May began to withdraw from Elias. It was a subtle, painful retreat. She no longer sat with him by the fire after Clara had gone to bed. She found tasks that kept them in separate spheres, weeding the garden when he was mending fences, salting meat inside when he was chopping wood outside. The easy companionship they had shared, born of years of quiet understanding, was fracturing. She was ceding ground, creating a space between them that she felt Clara was destined to fill. Every time she saw Elias look at the younger woman, she felt the ghost of her husband, Samuel, and the memory of the hole Elias had dug on the hill. She was terrified of seeing another man she cared for lost to a love that wasn't meant for her. Clara, in contrast, felt a desperate pull toward Elias. The fear of the unseen threat made her bolder. She saw him now not just as a man who stirred her heart, but as her protector, their protector. She found excuses to be near him. She would bring him a dipper of cool water while he worked, her fingers brushing his as he took it. She asked him to show her how to properly sharpen an axe, standing closer than she needed to, her shoulder almost touching his arm. She was no longer the frightened girl from the storm. She was a woman reaching for the only security she had ever known. And Elias, caught between May's deliberate distance and Clara's innocent magnetism, felt like he was being torn in two. One night, when the moon was a pale sliver in the sky, he found May alone by the hearth, darning one of his shirts. Clara was asleep. The silence was heavy with all the things they weren't saying. "May," he said, his voice rough. He stood across the room from her, unable to get closer. She looked up, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "Elias." He struggled for the words. a man unaccustomed to navigating the tangled wilderness of the heart. "I need to tell you something." He took a breath. "It's about the girl, Clara." May's gaze did not waver. "I know." "No," he insisted, shaking his head. "I feel something I haven't felt in a long time, since before." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew he meant the woman who had broken him. "It's different now, and it feels wrong, being here, under your roof." He finally looked her in the eyes, his own filled with a deep, conflicted pain. "I swear to you, May, I haven't forgotten. I can still see your face, clear as day, standing on that ridge while I was digging. I see it every damn night. The thought of bringing any more sorrow to this house." He trailed off, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. May set the shirt down in her lap. Her face was calm, but her eyes held the sorrow of a winter sky. "What you feel for her has nothing to do with me or Samuel," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "She's not a ghost, Elias, and neither are you. You're allowed to live." She picked up her sewing again, her head bent, a clear dismissal, but her words, meant perhaps to free him, only tightened the knot of guilt in his chest. He was allowed to live, but he felt he would be doing it on the grave of a good man, with the blessing of his grieving widow. The opportunity came a few nights later. A full moon hung in the sky, so bright it washed the landscape in silver and ink. A cougar had been bothering the horses, its tracks found too close to the corral for comfort. "I'm going to ride the perimeter," Elias announced after supper. "Make sure it's moved on." "I'll come with you," Clara said immediately, the words out before she could think. May looked from Clara's determined face to Elias's hesitant one. "It's a two-person job," May said quietly, giving her silent permission. "Be safe." They rode out not on their separate mounts, but on Elias's big steady gelding, Clara seated in front of him. The arrangement was practical. Her mare was still too skittish for night riding, but the intimacy of it was overwhelming. She was cocooned by his presence, his chest a solid wall at her back, his arms around her as he held the reins. Every shift of the horse pressed her closer to him. The scent of him, leather and clean sweat, filled her senses. They moved in silence through the moon-drenched landscape. The world was transformed. Familiar shapes made strange and beautiful. They rode through a high meadow where spring wildflowers, closed for the night, still perfumed the air. The only sounds were the creak of the saddle leather and the soft thud of the horse's hooves on the damp earth. Elias reined the horse to a stop at the edge of the meadow, his eyes scanning the dark line of trees on the far side. The silence stretched, filled with a tension that had nothing to do with a cougar. Clara could feel the warmth of his breath on her hair. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her back. "Elias," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He didn't answer. He just tightened his hold on the reins, his knuckles brushing against her waist. Slowly, she turned, a difficult maneuver in the close space. She had to place her hands on his chest to steady herself. She could feel the hard muscle beneath his shirt. She looked up at his face, cast in the stark beauty of the moonlight. The hardness was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability she had never seen before. His blue eyes, usually so guarded, were dark pools of longing and conflict. The world fell away. There was no cabin, no May, no Luther Raleigh, no unseen threat in the woods. There was only the silver light, the scent of wildflowers, and the man holding her. He lowered his head, and she lifted hers. Their first kiss was not a fiery explosion, but a tentative, questioning touch. It was soft, searching, and filled with all the unspoken words, all the pent-up emotion of the past months. It was a kiss of shared loneliness and blossoming hope. Then, as if a dam had broken, the pressure deepened. It became a kiss of desperate need, a raw, hungry claiming. His hand left the reins and came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. She clung to him, her hands gripping his shirt, anchoring herself in the storm he had unleashed in her. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other. The spell was broken, and reality came rushing back in, cold and sharp. Guilt, betrayal, fear. They had crossed a line, a sacred boundary, and the knowledge of it hung between them, heavier than any silence. The ride back to the cabin was a torment. They didn't speak, didn't touch. The space between their bodies, which had been charged with electric desire, was now a chasm of regret. The cabin was dark when they returned. A single lantern left burning low. May was nowhere to be seen. They assumed she had gone to bed. Clara lay on her cot, her body still humming, her mind in turmoil. She stared into the darkness, the memory of the kiss a brand on her lips. She had found a moment of pure, unadulterated joy, and it was poisoned by the pain she knew it would cause. A floorboard creaked near the door. Clara sat up. Elias was standing there, a silhouette against the dying embers in the hearth. He was looking toward May's bed. It was empty. The blankets were folded. A small canvas pack that always sat at the foot of her bed was gone. A cold dread washed over Clara.
"Elias?"
He turned, and even in the darkness, she could see the panic on his face. "She's gone." Clara threw off her blankets and rushed to the door, her limp all but forgotten. Outside, the moon illuminated a single set of tracks leading away from the cabin, toward the eastern hills.
"I have to find her,"
Clara cried, her voice cracking. "I'll saddle the horse," Elias said, his voice grim. "No," she said, grabbing his arm.
"This isn't for you. This is for me. I have to do this."
She ran, stumbling through the darkness, following the tracks, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She found May a mile from the cabin, sitting by a small, hastily built fire near a creek. She was wrapped in a blanket, staring into the flames, her face a portrait of utter desolation.
"May!"
Clara cried, skidding to a halt. May looked up, her expression hardening.
"Go back to the cabin. Clara."
"No," Clara said, walking closer, her breath coming in ragged gasps.
"Why did you leave? You can't leave."
"I can't stay," May said, her voice flat.
"There's no room for me there anymore."
"That's not true," Clara insisted, tears streaming down her face. "We need you! I need you!" "You have him now," May said, a bitter edge to her words.
"You have what you wanted."
The accusation struck Clara like a slap.
"It wasn't like that. I never meant to hurt you."
"Hurt me?" May let out a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. "Child, you don't know the first thing about hurt." She stood up, her tall frame seeming to block out the moonlight. "I took you in. I saved your life. I treated you like my own. And you, in my own home, under my roof. You took the one thing, the one person." She couldn't finish. Her voice choked with a pain so profound it was terrifying to witness. Clara broke down, sobbing.
"I'm sorry, May. I am so sorry."
She stumbled forward and wrapped her arms around the older woman, burying her face in the rough wool of her blanket.
"I love him, but I love you too."
For a moment, May remained rigid, a statue of grief. Then, with a shuddering sigh, her arms came up and wrapped around Clara, holding her tight. The anger dissolved, leaving only a raw, shared sorrow. They stood there for a long time, two women clinging to each other by a lonely fire, their tears mingling in the cold night air. Finally, they sank back down to the ground, still holding each other. Clara, her voice thick with tears, looked at May's face in the firelight. The question had to be asked. It was the heart of all this pain.
"I'm sorry,"
she whispered again. Then, gathering all her courage, she asked, "May, did you ever love him?" May looked at her, her clear gray eyes reflecting the dancing flames. 1,000 unspoken emotions passed through them: grief, affection, regret. and a loneliness so deep it seemed to have no bottom. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her answer was in the way she pulled Clara closer, her arms tightening in a fierce, protective, and heartbreaking embrace. It was a silence that said everything. They returned to the cabin as the first blush of dawn painted the eastern sky. A fragile truce held between them. Elias was waiting on the porch, his rifle resting across his lap, his face a grim mask of relief and worry. He saw them coming, May with her arm around Clara's shoulders, and the rigid line of his jaw softened. He stood, but said nothing, simply watching as they approached. The questions in his eyes were a silent storm, but he held them back. He understood, with a painful clarity, that whatever had happened by that lonely fire was a language he did not speak, a sacrament to which he was not invited. The day passed in a haze of strained politeness. They moved around each other with a careful, deliberate grace, the air thick with unspoken apologies and unresolved emotions. The kiss in the moonlight was a ghost that haunted every corner of the small cabin, a shared secret that both bound and separated them. They were three people on a precipice, terrified of falling, and yet unable to step back. The world outside the cabin, however, had no patience for the delicate state of their hearts. It happened in the late afternoon, when the sun slanted through the tall pines, striping the clearing with long shadows. Clara was outside, turning soil in May's small garden. May was at the creek, washing their linens. Elias was splitting the last of the winter logs, the rhythmic thwack of his axe the day's only percussion. A twig snapped in the woods. It was a sound Elias would normally have dismissed, but ever since he'd seen the shadow at the tree line, his senses were honed to a razor's edge. He let the axe fall, his hand going still. He didn't turn his head, but his whole body became an instrument of listening. He heard the rustle of leaves that was not made by the wind. He heard the heavy, clumsy step of men unaccustomed to moving silently. "Clara," he said, his voice low and calm, belying the surge of adrenaline in his veins. "Go inside, now." She looked up, startled by his tone. She saw the coiled stillness in him and didn't question it. She dropped the trowel and hurried toward the cabin door. At the same moment, two men stepped out of the woods. They were the men from Luther Raleigh's payroll. Jed, the weasel, had a smirk on his thin face and a long-barreled pistol in his hand. Silas, the brute, held a shotgun, his thumb resting casually on the hammer. "Well now, look what we have here," Jed said, his voice oily. He let his gaze slide over Clara as she froze by the cabin door. "Just the pretty little bird we were looking for. Mr. Raleigh sends his regards." Elias moved, placing himself squarely between them and Clara. He held the splitting axe in his hand, its weight a familiar comfort. "You've got no business here," he said, his voice a low growl. "Turn around and walk away." "We'll be leaving shortly," Jed sneered. "Just as soon as the lady comes with us. The horse, too. We have instructions about the horse." From the creek, May had heard the voices. She straightened up, a piece of wet linen in her hand, and saw the tableau, Elias facing down two armed men, Clara trapped near the door. For a moment, she was paralyzed, the world narrowing to the glint of sun on a shotgun barrel, a chilling echo of a day 5 years ago in the streets of Redemption. The memory of Samuel, lying in the mud, threatened to swallow her whole. Silas took a lumbering step forward. "Just give us the girl, Cowboy. No need for you to get hurt." "You're not touching her," Elias said. And in that moment, he was no longer a quiet, wounded man. He was a force of nature, a mountain lion defending its territory. He shifted his weight, preparing to lunge. That was the opening Jed was waiting for. While Silas drew Elias's attention, Jed darted to the side, his pistol aimed at Clara. "Don't be a hero," he shouted. Elias saw the move. He had a split second to choose, defend himself from Silas or protect Clara from Jed. He didn't hesitate. He threw the axe. It wasn't a wild heave, but a calculated spinning throw aimed not to kill but to disarm. The heavy blade spun end over end, catching the stock of Silas's shotgun and ripping it from the big man's grasp. But turning to throw left his side exposed. Silas, roaring with rage, lunged forward, pulling a wicked-looking skinning knife from his belt. Elias tried to turn back, but he was too slow. The knife sliced across his ribs. A flash of silver and a searing line of fire. He grunted in pain, stumbling back, his hand coming away from his side slick with blood. Clara screamed. The sound broke May's paralysis. The ghost of Samuel didn't vanish, but it was joined by a new, more powerful image. Elias, bleeding, Clara, terrified, her home, her sanctuary, being violated, a cold, clear rage, an emotion she hadn't felt in 5 years, washed through her. She dropped the laundry and ran toward the cabin, her bare feet pounding the earth. She burst through the back door and went straight to the large wooden chest at the foot of her bed. Her hands, shaking but sure, lifted the lid. Beneath a pile of old blankets lay Samuel's rifle, a Winchester, lovingly maintained, but untouched since the day he died. The cold steel of it was a shock to her system. It smelled of gun oil and memory. Outside, Silas was advancing on the wounded Elias. Jed had grabbed Clara by the arm, his pistol pressed to her head. "That's enough," he yelled, his voice high and nervous. "We're taking her now." The cabin door creaked open. May stepped out onto the porch. She was no longer the gentle, grieving widow. Her face was carved from granite, her gray eyes burning with a righteous fury that was terrifying to behold. She raised the Winchester to her shoulder, the movement as natural as if she'd done it yesterday. She didn't aim at Jed or Silas. She aimed at the ground, a few feet in front of them. The rifle's report was deafening, a crack of thunder that echoed off the hills. Splinters of wood and dirt erupted where the bullet struck. Jed and Silas froze, stunned. They looked at the woman on the porch. They had expected a frightened squatter's wife. They did not expect this avenging angel, her eyes promising a death as cold and final as the mountains themselves. They saw no hesitation in her, no fear, only certainty. "The next one," May said, her voice ringing with an authority they had never heard. "Won't miss?" She worked the lever action, the shuck-shuck of a new round being chambered a final, deadly promise. Elias, clutching his side, stared at her. He had known her for 3 years as a quiet, steady presence, a woman defined by her loss. He had never seen this woman, this fierce, unyielding protector. He saw the strength he had always known was there, but now it was forged into a weapon. A profound, heart-stopping respect bloomed in his chest, eclipsing everything else. He wasn't just looking at the woman who had given him shelter. He was looking at his equal. Jed, the weasel, was a bully, not a fighter. He shoved Clara away from him and began to backpedal. "This ain't worth it," he stammered, his eyes wide. "The money ain't worth this." Silas hesitated, his dull eyes flickering from May to the bleeding Elias, then back to his partner, who was already disappearing into the trees, with a final, hateful glare. He turned and followed, the two of them melting back into the woods from which they came. The silence they left behind was absolute. Clara scrambled to her feet and rushed to Elias, who had sagged against a log, his face pale. May lowered the rifle, the strength seeming to drain out of her all at once. She leaned against the porch railing, the heavy gun suddenly a terrible weight in her hands. They half carried, half dragged him inside and laid him on his cot. The knife wound was deep, a long, ugly gash that oozed blood, staining his shirt and the rough blanket beneath him. For a moment, Clara and May just stood there, looking down at him, the adrenaline of the fight giving way to the stark reality of the wound. Then, their eyes met over his prone body, and a silent understanding passed between them. There was no more jealousy, no more rivalry. There was only Elias, and the shared, desperate need to save him. They worked together as if they'd been doing it their whole lives. May brought a basin of hot water and clean rags, while Clara fetched the small wooden box of medicinal herbs and salves. They cut away his bloody shirt, revealing the hard-muscled landscape of his chest and the angry red wound on his side. May began to clean the gash, her touch surprisingly gentle. Clara knelt on the other side, holding a clean cloth to press against the wound when May told her to. Their movements were synchronized, efficient, a quiet ballet of healing. As May carefully stitched the wound closed with a fine needle and gut thread, her brow furrowed in concentration. Clara reached out to wipe a smear of blood from his chest. At the same moment, May shifted her own hand to steady herself. Their hands met, Clara's palm covering the back of May's. The touch was electric. They both froze. It was a simple, fleeting contact, but in that moment, the entire world seemed to shift on its axis. They weren't two separate women tending to a man. They were 3 points of a single, interconnected whole. Clara's fingers were intertwined with May's, both resting on the warm skin of the man who formed the center of their universe. They could feel his heartbeat, faint but steady, beneath their palms. It felt like they were feeling it together, a single pulse passing through all three of them. They looked at each other, their eyes wide with a startling, profound realization. This connection, this triangle of fate, was real. It was tangible, and it was unbreakable. They finished their work in silence, bandaging the wound tightly. Elias had drifted into a feverish, pain-filled sleep. As night fell, a storm rolled in, the one that had been threatening for days. Rain lashed against the roof, and the wind howled around the small cabin, isolating them completely from the rest of the world. They couldn't leave him alone. May brought her quilt and lay down on the floor on one side of his cot. Clara brought her own and lay on the other. They lay in the darkness, flanking him, guarding him. The only light was from the embers of the fire, casting a faint, red glow. The only sounds were the storm outside and Elias's shallow, ragged breathing. No one spoke. Words were useless, inadequate. The silence was filled with a maelstrom of emotions. Fear for Elias, the lingering terror of the attack, the raw, undeniable intimacy of their situation. Clara could hear May's quiet breathing, just a few feet away. She could feel the warmth radiating from Elias's feverish body. They were a small, human island in a sea of darkness and storm, huddled together for warmth and for life itself. Hours passed. Elias groaned in his sleep, his body twitching. In the near darkness, Clara's eyes met May's. They were both awake, both keeping vigil.
"May,"
Clara whispered, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the sound of the rain.
"I'm here,"
May whispered back. Clara's heart ached with a love so large and complicated she felt it might break her.
"If you need him,"
she said, the words a painful sacrifice. "If he is what your heart needs to heal. I'll go. I'll leave in the morning. I will step back." The silence stretched, and for a moment, Clara thought May hadn't heard her. Then, May's voice came back through the darkness, quiet but strong, and filled with a truth so clear and simple it cut through all the pain and confusion. "We both need him. Clara!"
"Not I need him. Not you need him. We—"
The words settled in the space between them, a foundation stone for a new world they hadn't known they were building. Clara closed her eyes, a single tear of profound, shattering relief slipping down her cheek. They were in this together. The fever broke 2 days later. Elias woke to the soft light of morning, his mind clear for the first time since the attack. The pain in his side was a dull, hot fire, but he was alive. He looked to his left and saw Clara, asleep in a chair, her head resting on the edge of his cot, her hand near his. He looked to his right and saw May, also asleep in a rocking chair, a rifle resting against the wall beside her. They had not left his side. The knowledge settled deep in his bones, a warmth that had nothing to do with fever. He had been protected. He had been cared for. He had been loved. In the week that followed, as his strength returned, the dynamics in the cabin shifted again. The tension was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful tenderness. There were no more stolen glances or hesitant touches. There was an open, honest affection. May would bring him soup, and Clara would read to him from an old, tattered book of poems she had found. They would sit together in the evenings, the three of them, and talk, sharing stories of their pasts, filling in the silent spaces that had existed between them for so long. One night, the air was warm and smelled of rain-washed earth. Elias was strong enough to sit on the porch, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Clara and May sat on the steps below him. The moon was rising, full and white, over the dark silhouette of the pines. No one planned it. No one willed it. It happened as naturally as the rising of the moon. Clara, feeling a slight chill, leaned back, her shoulder coming to rest against Elias's knee. He instinctively placed his hand on her shoulder. A simple, comforting gesture. May, watching them, felt not a pang of jealousy, but a wave of deep, quiet love for them both. She reached out and placed her hand on Clara's other shoulder, her thumb stroking the back of her neck. And there they were, connected, a circuit of touch, of warmth, of unspoken understanding. Clara tilted her head back, looking up at Elias. His gaze was soft, filled with a raw, unguarded emotion she had never seen. He leaned down, and she met him halfway, their lips meeting in a kiss that was gentle, familiar, and achingly tender. It held no guilt, only a quiet certainty. When they parted, Clara turned her head and looked at May. May was smiling, a true, genuine smile that reached her clear gray eyes. And then May leaned forward, and her lips brushed against Clara's in a kiss as soft as a moth's wing, a gesture of profound affection and acceptance. Elias watched, and his heart, which he had thought was a barren, rocky landscape, felt like it was overflowing. He reached out his free hand, and May took it, her strong fingers lacing with his. They stayed like that for a long time, under the silent, watchful moon. 3 separate souls, 3 broken histories, 3 lonely hearts, woven together by fate and choice into a single, intricate, and beautiful tapestry. It was a moment of perfect, fragile peace, a quiet defiance against a world that would never understand. It was not a choice between 2 paths, but the creation of a new one, forged in the wilderness by 3 people who had discovered that home was not a place, but a configuration of the heart. The following morning, the sun rose, brilliant and clear. Elias awoke to find the cabin empty. The cots where Clara and May had been sleeping were neatly made. A cold knot of panic seized him. He struggled to his feet, his side protesting, and stumbled to the door. He found May by the corral, saddling her horse. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep and fear. May looked at him, her expression calm but sad. "She's gone. I saw her heading for the creek at first light. She feels the guilt of it all. Elias, the attack, and this, she thinks she's a poison in our lives." "She's not a poison," Elias said, his voice fierce. "She's the water we didn't know we were dying for." May gave him a small, sad smile. "I know." She finished cinching the saddle. "Let's go get our girl." They found her by the same stream where she and May had made their peace. She was sitting on a rock, hugging her knees, her face stained with tears. She looked up as they approached. Elias on foot, limping slightly. May leading the horse. "I have to go," Clara said, her voice choked. "I bring nothing but trouble. You were safe before I came." "We were quiet," May corrected her gently, stopping a few feet away. "We were not safe. We were just waiting to die, in our own ways. You reminded us how to live." Elias came and stood beside May. He looked down at Clara, his heart aching. "We're not choosing." "Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not between you and May, not between the past and the future. We are choosing this. All of it. All three of us." He held out his hand. May, beside him, held out hers. Clara looked at their outstretched hands, then at their faces. May's, calm and strong. Elias's, open and pleading. The tears came again, but this time they were not tears of guilt or sorrow. They were tears of a joy so vast and overwhelming she had no words for it. She stood up, and she took their hands, one for each of hers, and, together, the three of them walked back to the cabin, not as a man and two women, but as a family, their shadows merging into one in the bright morning sun. The summer that followed was a season of quiet creation. The fragile truce forged in the moonlight and sealed by the stream hardened into a foundation as solid as the granite hills themselves. They did not talk about what they were or what they had become. There were no words for it in the world they knew. Instead, they lived it. They built their life together, each action a testament to their unspoken covenant. Clara, with a deep, primal need to nurture life from the barren ground, took over May's small garden and expanded it. She coaxed green shoots of beans, squash, and corn from the dark. Rich earth. Her hands, once soft and pale, became tanned and capable, her nails permanently rimmed with soil. To see things grow under her care was a daily miracle, a defiant act of creation against the memory of the life that had almost been stolen from her. The vibrant green of the garden was a splash of impossible color against the muted tones of the wilderness. May, finding solace in the rhythmic order of the loom, brought Samuel's old weaving frame out from storage. She taught Clara how to card wool and spin thread, and soon the cabin was filled with the gentle, rhythmic thump-thump of the shuttle passing back and forth. May wove blankets of deep reds and blues, the colors of sunset and twilight, her hands moving with a grace and certainty that spoke of a peace she had not known in years. She was no longer just surviving. She was creating warmth and beauty, weaving the threads of their three lives into a single, strong fabric. Elias, driven by a desire to expand and protect their sanctuary, began building an addition to the cabin. With an axe and an adze, he felled pines, squared the logs, and began raising the walls of a new kitchen. The work was hard, his newly healed side often aching in protest, but it was joyful labor. He worked with a focus and purpose that was new to him. Every perfectly notched log, every tightly sealed chink, was an act of devotion. He was not just building a room. He was making their small world larger, creating a space for the family he had never imagined he could have. They fell into a natural, easy rhythm. They worked side by side, their movements often overlapping in a silent, comfortable dance. Clara would bring him water as he worked, her hand lingering on his as he drank. May would bring them both their midday meal, her quiet smile encompassing them both. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the stars emerge, their shoulders often touching, their hands sometimes finding each other in the darkness. There was a simple, profound peace in their shared existence, a world of three built in defiance of the world of 1 + 1. They were a secret, a myth, an impossible truth, living and breathing in the heart of the wilderness. But the world outside had a long memory and a cruel sense of justice. Luther Raleigh had not forgotten the escape of his 2 hired men, their tails between their legs and a story of a wild-eyed widow with a Winchester had only stoked the flames of his fury. His wounded pride had festered into a cold, calculated obsession. He would not be beaten by a slip of a girl and her backwoods companions. If brute force had failed, he would use the one weapon they could not fight, the law. He arrived one clear autumn morning, when the aspen trees on the hills had turned a brilliant, trembling gold. He was not alone. He rode a fine black gelding and was flanked by a grim-faced sheriff from Redemption and a slender, pale man in a city suit who was clearly a lawyer. The three of them were in the clearing when Elias looked up from sharpening his axe. May and Clara, who had been hanging blankets to air in the sun, froze. The idyllic peace of their summer shattered like glass. "Clara Raleigh," the lawyer called out, his voice thin and reedy, utterly out of place in the vast silence of the mountains. "By the authority of the territory of Wyoming, I have here a warrant." Elias stepped forward, the axe still in his hand. "Her name is not Raleigh," he said, his voice a low rumble. "And you have no authority here." The sheriff, a weary-looking man with a drooping mustache, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Now, son, let's not have any trouble. This is official business." "This is my home," Elias countered, his knuckles white on the axe handle. Luther Raleigh sneered from his horse. "This is a den of inequity. You, sir, are harboring a runaway wife, a fugitive from a sacred and legally binding contract of marriage." He looked past Elias, his eyes fixing on Clara with a triumphant, venomous glare. "The contract was signed. The vows were spoken before God. She belongs to me." "She belongs to no one but herself," May said, stepping forward to stand beside Elias. The sight of her seemed to give Luther pause, but the lawyer simply unrolled his scroll of paper. "Elias Kane," the lawyer read, "you are under arrest for interfering with a marital contract, for harboring a fugitive, and for assault on the persons of Jedediah Skaggs and Silas Croft." He looked up. "And you, ma'am, will be charged as an accomplice." Elias let out a harsh laugh. "Assault? They came here with guns drawn." "Their word against yours, I'm afraid," the lawyer said with a thin smile. "And Mr. Raleigh is a respected man of property. You are a drifter with no standing." The world tilted on its axis. They were trapped, not by guns, but by papers and lies. The sheriff drew his revolver, his face apologetic but firm. "Son, drop the axe." Elias looked at Clara, at May. He saw the terror in Clara's eyes, the cold fury in May's. He could fight. He could probably take the sheriff, maybe even the lawyer, but he couldn't fight a bullet. And if he fell, they would be left alone with Luther. Slowly, with a look of utter defeat, he let the axe slip from his fingers and fall to the dirt. The sheriff's men bound his hands. As they led him away, Luther dismounted, a look of vile satisfaction on his face. He walked toward the cabin, a lit torch in his hand. He had brought it for this very purpose. "No!" Clara screamed, trying to run forward, but May held her back, her grip like iron. "A place of such sin must be cleansed by fire," Luther declared, his voice ringing with false piety. He tossed the torch onto the dry timber of the porch. The flames caught instantly, licking up the seasoned logs that Elias had so carefully hewn. The fire roared, consuming their home, their sanctuary, their beautiful, impossible world. The new kitchen Elias had built, the loom where May had woven their blankets, the small cot where Clara had healed. It was all turning to smoke and ash. They could only stand and watch, helpless, as Luther Raleigh mounted his horse, a silhouette against the inferno he had created. He had not just reclaimed his property, he had salted the earth where she had found happiness. As the sheriff's posse disappeared down the trail with Elias, May knew they had only minutes. "Clara, run!" she commanded, pulling her toward the woods on the far side of the clearing.
"We have to go, now!"
They fled into the forest, the crackle of the fire and the crashing of their burning home, a monstrous roar at their backs. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs ached, leaving behind the smoking ruin of their life, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the ashes of their dream in their hearts. May did not run without a destination. She moved with a desperate, ingrained purpose, leading Clara on a hard, punishing journey eastward, away from the familiar trails and into a rugged, trackless wilderness. For 2 days they traveled, living on foraged berries and the grim determination in May's eyes. They were heading toward the Wind River Basin, a land May had not set foot in for over 20 years, a land she had fled, her ancestral land, They arrived at the edge of a small, hidden village of Cheyenne lodges, nestled in a valley carved by a winding river. The air smelled of sage and wood smoke, a scent both alien and deeply familiar to May. As they approached, people emerged from the lodges, their faces curious and wary. They looked at the two women, one white, one whose features were an echo of their own, both dressed in worn settlers' clothing. An old woman with a face like a beautiful, wrinkled map and eyes as dark and knowing as the earth stepped forward. "Micah," she said, her voice soft. It was May's Cheyenne name, the one she had not heard since she was a girl. "You have come home." It was her mother's sister. In the safety of her aunt's lodge, the story of their flight tumbled out. But as May spoke, she was forced to confront the ghosts she had spent a lifetime running from here. She was not the quiet, self-sufficient widow from the Granite Hills. She was Micah, daughter of a Cheyenne woman and a white trapper, a child of two worlds, belonging to neither. She had left this place as a young woman, unable to bear the scorn of both sides. In redemption, she was the half-breed's squaw, here among her mother's people. She was a constant reminder of the encroaching white world, her lighter eyes and settler ways a mark of otherness. She had chosen a life of isolation with Samuel, a man who loved her for who she was, not what she was. In his eyes, she was just May. But now, that solitary world was gone, and she was forced to reclaim the part of herself she had tried to erase. "The white man's law has a long reach," her aunt said, her voice heavy with the wisdom of generations of sorrow. "But it does not reach here. You are safe among your mother's people." That night, as they sat by the fire, her aunt told Clara the story May never would. She spoke of May's mother, a proud, strong woman who was an outcast for loving a white man. She told of how, after the trapper was killed by a bear, a sickness swept through the village, and the elders, steeped in fear and suspicion, had blamed the woman who had strayed from their ways. She wasn't killed, but she was treated unjustly, cast out, her spirit broken. She had died a year later, leaving a young May to carry the weight of that inherited shame. Clara looked at May, who was staring into the fire, her face a mask of old pain. Clara finally understood the true depth of May's solitude, the reason she had built such high walls around her life and her heart. She had been running not just from grief, but from her very blood. In the days that followed, Clara wrestled with her own demons. She was safe, but Elias was not. He was in a cell in redemption, at the mercy of Luther Raleigh. The guilt was a physical weight, a sickness in her stomach. She was the cause of all this. Her flight, her love, her happiness. It had all led to the destruction of their home and the imprisonment of the man she loved. One evening, she found May by the river, skipping stones across the water's surface, a skill she'd learned as a girl. "I have to go back," Clara said, her voice tight with resolve. "I'm going to turn myself in. I'll tell them Elias had nothing to do with it, that he was holding me against my will. They'll let him go if I go back to Luther." The words tasted like poison, but she forced them out. It was the only way. May turned, her gray eyes flashing with a fire Clara had not seen since the day of the attack. She walked over and gripped Clara's arms, her fingers digging in. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice a low, fierce whisper. "Don't you dare throw away everything we have fought for." "But Elias—" "What about Elias?" May cut her off. "Do you think he wants his freedom at the cost of yours? Do you think he could live with himself, knowing you were back in that man's house, knowing you had sacrificed yourself for him?" "But I can't just do nothing," Clara cried, tears of frustration and despair streaming down her face. May's expression softened, but her grip remained firm. She looked directly into Clara's eyes, her gaze steady and filled with a terrible, loving honesty. "Listen to me, Clara. This is no longer just about you and him. It is about us, all of us. If you surrender, you will lose him, and you will lose me. You will break the only thing we have left. Do you understand?" The truth of her words was absolute, shattering Clara's desperate, noble plan. To surrender wasn't a sacrifice, it was a betrayal. It was an admission that their life together, their family of 3, was not worth fighting for.
"Then what do we do?"
Clara whispered, her last vestiges of hope crumbling.
"We fight,"
May said simply.
"Not with guns. Not this time. With the truth."
They sat by the river as twilight fell, their minds racing. They were 2 women, fugitives, with no standing and no power in the white man's world. They needed help, an ally, someone who could stand against Luther Raleigh.
"Elias,"
May said suddenly, her eyes lighting up with a flicker of memory. "He once told me about a man he knew. Years ago, before he met me. They rode together for a time."
"Who was he?"
Clara asked, leaning forward. "He was the sheriff of a cattle town down in Colorado. A good man," Elias said. "A fair man. Stood up to a lynch mob to save an innocent man. Elias was there. He helped him." May paused, trying to recall the details. "Elias took a bullet meant for him. Saved his life." A desperate hope began to bloom in Clara's chest.
"Where is he now?"
"That's the thing," May said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "According to Elias, he got tired of the violence. He put down his guns and picked up a Bible. He's a preacher now, in a small town called Providence, about a week's ride from here." It was a long shot, a desperate prayer cast into the wilderness, but it was the only shot they had. That night, by the light of a small fire in her aunt's lodge, they composed a letter, using a piece of charcoal on a strip of cured hide. Clara wrote as May dictated. They told him everything, of Clara's escape, of the life they had built, of Luther's vengeance, and of Elias's capture. They didn't ask for much. They simply told the truth and appealed to the memory of the good man Elias had saved.
"He is in jail in redemption,"
Clara wrote, her hands shaking slightly.
"He is innocent. Please, for the life he saved, help us save his—"
The next morning, May gave the letter to a young, trusted brave from the village. She gave him the last thing of value she had, a small silver locket of her mother's, as payment. "Ride like the wind," she told him in Cheyenne. "Find the man of God in Providence. Give this only to him." They watched him ride out of the valley, a lone figure carrying their last, desperate hope. Then they turned back to the village, to wait, suspended between despair and a fragile, flickering prayer. The waiting was a unique form of torture. For 10 days, May and Clara existed in a state of suspended animation in the Cheyenne village. They worked, ate, and slept, but a part of them was far away, locked in a dusty cell in redemption with Elias. Every sunrise brought a fresh wave of anxiety, and every sunset a deeper gloom. Hope was a flickering candle flame, threatening to be extinguished by the slightest breeze of doubt. On the 11th morning, a rider was spotted on the horizon. It was not the young brave they had sent out, but a tall, broad-shouldered man on a powerful roan horse. He rode with an easy, confident posture, but as he drew closer, they saw his clothing was the simple black of a clergyman, a stark white collar at his throat. His face was weathered, kind, but his eyes, a clear, penetrating blue, held the unmistakable authority of a man who had seen the worst of the world and had not flinched. He rode directly to the lodge of May's aunt and dismounted. "I am looking for 2 women," he said, his voice a calm baritone that carried in the quiet morning air. "One named May, the other Clara. I am the Reverend Jacob Vance." Hope, fierce and blinding, surged through Clara's heart. They had been heard. Their prayer had been answered. Reverend Vance listened to their story again, his gaze missing nothing. He looked at Clara's earnest, tear-streaked face and at May's stoic, proud bearing. He saw not sin, but survival. When they were finished, he nodded slowly. "Elias Kane once stood between me and a bullet," he said, his voice resonating with old gratitude. He told me then that some things are worth dying for. It seems he has finally found his... He looked at the two women before him. Mr. Raleigh's brand of justice is a disease. The only cure is the truth. He turned to May. The letter said the trial is set for the day after tomorrow. We ride for redemption at once, but we will not be riding alone. He had not come unprepared. Tucked in his saddlebags were not just Bibles, but ledgers, deeds, and sworn affidavits he had spent the last week gathering. He had called on old contacts, men who owed him favors, men who knew the dark corners of Luther Raleigh's business dealings. He was not coming to preach mercy. He was coming to deliver a reckoning. The trial was held not in a proper courthouse, but in the town's largest saloon, the air still thick with the ghosts of last night's whiskey. The entire town of Redemption had turned out, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and self-righteous judgment. Elias stood before a makeshift judge's bench, his hands bound, his face bruised but his posture unbent. He looked out at the sea of hostile faces, searching for two he knew he would not find, praying they were safe. Luther Raleigh sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by his lawyer, looking for all the world like a respected patriarch wronged. His lawyer laid out the case with cold precision, a signed marriage contract, a consecrated vow, a runaway bride, and the scoundrel who had harbored her and assaulted the men sent to retrieve her. It was a simple, ugly story, and the crowd murmured in agreement. This man, this Ellis Kane, the lawyer concluded, pointing a dramatic finger, has flouted the laws of God and man. He has broken a home, stolen property, and brought shame upon this good community. He must be made an example of. The judge, a portly merchant who owed Luther a great deal of money, was about to bang his gavel when the saloon doors swung open. Three figures stood silhouetted against the bright morning sun. The Reverend Jacob Vance walked in first, his presence commanding an immediate silence. Behind him, walking tall and unafraid, were May and Clara. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Elias's head snapped up, his eyes locking with theirs, a mixture of horror and profound love on his face. He had wanted them anywhere but here. "Apologies for the interruption, Your Honor," Reverend Vance said, his voice calm but carrying to every corner of the room. "But I believe this court has been presented with a carefully curated fiction. I am here to offer the truth." Luther Raleigh shot to his feet, his face turning a blotchy purple. "Who is this man? This has nothing to do with him." "On the contrary," Vance said, stepping forward and placing a heavy leather satchel on the judge's bench. "It has everything to do with me, and with justice." He looked out at the crowd. "My name is Jacob Vance, and I have come to speak for a man who once saved my life. But first, I'd like to speak about Mr. Luther Raleigh." For the next hour, the saloon was transformed into a courtroom of a different kind. With the unerring precision of the lawman he used to be, Vance dismantled Luther Raleigh's life, lie by lie. He produced a forged land deed, showing how Raleigh had cheated a family of Mexican settlers out of their ancestral ranch. He read a sworn affidavit from a former business partner whom Raleigh had bankrupted and threatened into silence. He unspooled a web of deceit, usury, and intimidation that had choked the prosperity of the entire region. The final blow came when he looked directly at May. "And finally," he said, his voice dropping, "I would like to talk about the death of a good man named Samuel Perkins, 5 years ago, right here on the streets of Redemption." A hush fell over the room. "He was shot down," Vance continued, "over an alleged debt to Mr. Raleigh, a debt for which no record has ever been found. The only witness, a stable hand who has since disappeared, claimed the argument was not about money, but about water rights. Water rights that Mr. Raleigh illegally acquired for himself the week after Samuel Perkins was buried." He let the accusation hang in the air, thick and poisonous. He hadn't proven murder, but he had painted a picture so damning, so clear, that no one in the room could doubt its truth. The foundation of Luther Raleigh's power, built on fear and a carefully constructed illusion of respectability, crumbled into dust. The trial was over. The judge, seeing the tide of public opinion turn so violently, banged his gavel. "All charges against Elias Kane are dismissed," he declared, his voice trembling. "Luther Raleigh, you are under arrest pending a full investigation by a federal marshal." The sheriff, his face a mixture of shame and relief, unlocked Elias's bonds and then, with a new firmness in his step, arrested a sputtering, defeated Luther Raleigh. Elias was free. He walked through the parting crowd toward May and Clara. He pulled them both into a fierce, desperate embrace, burying his face in their hair. The three of them, a silent, solid island in the churning sea of the saloon. But their ordeal was not over. The crowd, cheated of one villain, simply turned their judgment upon another. Their lifestyle, hinted at by Luther's lawyer, was now the subject of venomous whispers that grew into open accusations. "What kind of people are they?" a woman in a church bonnet shrilled. "It's unnatural," a man shouted. "Living up there in the hills like animals. A man with 2 women." "Heathens," another voice cried out. "They're an abomination." The crowd began to press in, their faces contorted with a righteous, ugly fury. They were no longer a town, they were a mob, and they had found a new target for their fear and hatred. Elias put himself in front of the 2 women, his body a shield, his face a thunderous mask of rage. But it was May who stepped forward. She moved past Elias, her head held high, her back straight. She faced the crowd, her clear gray eyes meeting theirs without a trace of fear. The blood of her Cheyenne mother and her trapper father flowed in her veins. And in that moment, she was the proud, unshakable daughter of both. She would not be an outcast anymore. "You want to know what kind of people we are?" she asked, her voice not loud, but clear and strong, cutting through the din. "I will tell you." She told them everything. She spoke of Clara, a girl sold like cattle, running for her life from a cruel man you all called respectable. She told of finding her half dead in a blizzard, a broken thing in a ruined dress. She told of nursing her back to health, of the quiet man who had dug her husband's grave and protected their home. "You call us heathens," May's voice rose, filled with a passion that silenced the entire room. "We survived a winter that would have killed any one of you. We built a home with our own hands. We planted a garden and pulled life from the dirt. We faced down armed men that your respectable Mr. Raleigh sent to drag a woman back to a life of misery." Her gaze swept across their faces, pinning them with the force of her truth. "You talk of God and sin. We lived by the only law that matters in the wilderness. We cared for each other. We were kind to each other. When one of us was broken, the others were there to mend them. When one of us was lost, the others were there to find them." She paused, taking a deep breath, and delivered her final, devastating truth. "You see a man and 2 women and you whisper of sin. I see a family forged in grief and fear, and sealed with loyalty and with love, a love that is bigger and truer than any of you have ever known. We have survived. We have loved, and we have forgiven each other for not being perfect. Now, I ask you, which one of you has the right to cast the first stone?" Absolute silence descended upon the saloon. In the back, a woman, the blacksmith's wife who knew a thing or two about hardship, slowly, deliberately nodded her head. Then a man near the front, a simple farmer, cleared his throat and spoke into the quiet. "They ain't hurting nobody," he said, not to May, but to his neighbors. "They just want to live in peace. Who are we to say how they do it?" The spell was broken. The mob mentality fractured, dissolving back into a room of individuals, their faces now etched with shame and a grudging respect. They began to shuffle out, unable to meet May's unflinching gaze. They did not stay in redemption. There was nothing for them there but ghosts and ashes. They bought supplies with the money Reverend Vance pressed into their hands and turned their backs on the town for good. They did not return to the Granite Hills. The memory of the fire was too painful. They traveled east into a high green valley May knew from her childhood, a place of clean water and plentiful game. And there, on a gentle slope overlooking a winding creek, they began again. They built their new home together. Elias felled the trees, his axe swinging with a joyful strength. Clara, her hands now strong and calloused, peeled the bark and helped him set the foundation stones. May, using her knowledge of the old ways, chinked the logs with a mixture of mud and grass that would set as hard as iron. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their movements a seamless, practiced dance. Their laughter echoed in the valley, a sound of pure, unadulterated freedom. This was not a cabin built by one man for his family. It was a home being raised by the 3 people who would live in it, every log and every stone a testament to their shared future. On the night they finished the roof, they built a large fire in the clearing and sat before it, watching the sparks spiral up to meet the stars. The moon was a perfect silver dollar in the black sky. They were tired, their bodies aching from the honest labor, but their hearts were full. Clara leaned her head against Elias's shoulder, and May's hand found hers in the space between them. Elias put his arm around them both, pulling them close. They sat in a comfortable, perfect silence, listening to the crackle of the fire and the song of the creek.
"It's funny,"
Clara whispered into the quiet, her voice filled with a soft wonder.
"I once fled a single wedding night, only to find a lifetime of them."
May squeezed her hand, and Elias kissed the top of her head. They sat there for a long time, 3 hearts beating as one in the vast, wild, and forgiving heart of the West. They had survived the storms, the fires, and the judgments of the world. They had looked into the abyss and chosen to build a bridge across it, together, here under the endless starry sky. There were no more choices to be made. They were simply home. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more stories like this, and feel free to share your thoughts on Clara, May, and Elias.